Hi everybody and welcome to Wine Flash. My name is Michael Wade and I am very inspired today because I have a story to tell you. Of course it's a wine story, but if you're into wine, art, history, literature, poetry, you're going to love this story. And if you have any roots to Italy, you'll love this story. You're going to like even more. Now, every wine has a story to tell. Now sometimes we forget that when we're shopping in stores and we walk around and you see thousands of bottles lining all these shelves. You don't realize that behind every label, each bottle has a story. They don't come from pages of books, they come from the labels. But however, as we know, not every story is the same. And this story is such a fantastic story. It was so moving to me once I started looking at this label that I had to share it with you. Now, the wine of the day we're talking about is Cerigo Alghieri in Toscana. Now, I want to get this part out of the way, not because I want to get to the real good part of the story. This wine, because it's on Wine Flash, you should know by now that the wines that I showcase on here are wines that over-deliver for their price. And if you look for it, you are going to find this wine. Wine Flash is going to have this price cheaper than probably anywhere else in the entire country. And that's two great things about Wine Flash. Throwing free shipping, there's three. With that being said, let me tell you a little bit about the wine, and then let's get into the story. Cerigo Alghieri in Toscano. It's mostly Sangiovese. It's a super Tuscan. It has some Caniolo in it. It also has a small amount of Ciligiolo. These are all indigenous grapes to Tuscany, which, remember that because it's important to the story to know that these grapes are all from Tuscany. It's a ruby red in color. It's a full-bodied wine. It's a very versatile one. It has berry flavors and licorice flavors, but it goes with almost any food, especially meats, and especially like hearty meats. Now, into the story. Remember I told you this story is going to come all from the label. Cerigo Alghieri. Now, that's the family name. What's cool about this, and an author who I know once told me that there's no such thing as coincidences. And I think that's kind of a cool saying. And in this case, it actually works because on here we have the vintage 2010. Well, if you move these numbers around to 1200, that is when this story starts. Because that is when the Alghieri family, they first settled in Florence. And Florence is in Tuscany, which is in the central part of Italy. Now, it's also the area where it's the birthplace of the Italian Renaissance. So we're talking, it's a pretty hot spot. Now, there was a member of the Alghieri family who became so famous that he got to drop his last name and the whole world knew who he was. And this is way before Madonna, way before Cher. His name is Dante. And, you know, if someone says the word Dante's Inferno, now all of a sudden you know exactly who we're talking about. Dante was a fabulous poet, writer, genius. Now, Dante, unfortunately for him, he was born in Florence, but in 1302 he was exiled from the land he loved. He fought for his town. He fought in wars to fight, but he was very passionate, like a lot of writers are. He was very passionate about politics and religion. And unfortunately, you know, back then you had a lot of uprisings with governments and different governments coming in and out of power. Unfortunately for Dante, he ended up on the wrong side, and he was forced to leave the land he grew up in. So he went up north. He went up to Verona with his kids, and while he's there, they settled in an area which is not as fancy of a dress probably then as it is now, but it's now known as the designated vineyard area of Valpolicella. And his family's been making wine there since 1350 is when his son started making wine. Now, how does someone become so famous that they get to drop their name, their last name, and still be known everywhere? Well, Dante is known as the father of the Italian language. And it's because of a literary masterpiece that he wrote called The Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy was made up in three parts. It shows how it starts with Dante traveling through hell, and then he goes through purgatory, and then he ends up in heaven. Now it's called the comedy because it's called a comedy we think of comedy as haha, very funny. Well, that's not how it used to be back then. if you can reference Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote tragedies. Many of them are very sad, sad endings. Since we're talking about Italy, think about Romeo and Juliet. Did not end very well. But anything that was considered a happy ending is called a comedy back then. Now, Dante's book ended with him going to heaven where he met his first love, Beatrice. Dante met Beatrice and fell passionately in love with her when he was 9 years old. We can all remember what life was like when we were 9, how passionate we were about everything. So first love meant a lot. So he goes to heaven, he sees Beatrice, she brings him to the Virgin Mary, and he finds salvation. Now, what's a happier ending than spending eternity with your first love? Not much, right? So that's a great story. But unfortunately for Dante, in real life, it didn't work out that well. As I told you, he got exiled. And then he spent a number of years trying to fight back and get back into Florence. And he was never successful. And what happened, if he ended up going back to Florence, they would have put him to death at the stake. They would have burned him. That's how they did it back then. So poor Dante. He then goes, he's still up north, and that's when he writes his great book. And when he starts getting all of this tremendous press and so much popularity, for him, he always dreamed of a triumphant return back to Florence. And he thought that this literary device would get him there. And it wasn't just his book that made Dante so famous. It's how he wrote it. He wrote it in Italian, and I quote, at the time it was called the vulgar language of Italian, the language spoken by women and children, end of quote. Every other book up to this point was written in Latin. Dante was the first one to actually use the Italian language and write it down. And that's how he became so famous. Now, if you look at this label again, Cerigo, Alighieri, in Toscana. Now, the in Toscana part, does that mean anything? Is it just like saying Cirque du Soleil in Vegas? Is it like saying Cirque du Soleil now in New York? No, it means a lot. It means because his family came from Tuscany, and now they're exiled from Tuscany. But 700 years later, the Count of Cerigo Alighieri, the direct descendant of Dante, who owns wonderful vineyards up north in Valpolicella, brought an estate in Tuscany and made a wine in homage to his great ancestor Dante. It took 700 years for Dante to fulfill his dream of going back to where he was born. Now these words, bello ovile, it translates into fair sheepfold. Now what does fair sheepfold mean? A sheepfold is a pen where you keep your sheep. To most people that wouldn't mean much, except it is a literary reference to the third book of Dante's when he's in heaven, and it is a metaphorical reference to Dante's childhood growing up in Florence. His childhood meant so much to him, and he had such a strong ties to his land, to his birthplace, that's why he wanted to get back so badly. And he did. It took help of his family to get there, but eventually he got there. Now, this crest, you see the family crest. I love tradition. We're a young country still, United States. I hope we revert back and we remember where we came from and we don't forget about our traditions. Family crest meant a lot. You'll see on there that there's 3 swords. The 3 swords represent the 3 counts of Cerigo. The plumes, there's an eagle, there's more plumes, and then there's another bird at the top. That represents the Alighieri family. This crest has been their family crest for hundreds of years, and they still use it today. I mean, I love that. I love that about it. Now, if you look at the bottom, it says, in collaboration with Masi. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of Masi. Masi is Masi Vineyard up north, also in the Valpolicella region. They've been making wines, award-winning wines, for hundreds of years. In fact, the Boscani family, they purchased their first vineyard up there in the late 1700s. They still own it today. They still own 100%, operate it, manage it every way possible. They still have kept control over it. Well, about 20 years ago, you've had a collaboration between the Boscani family and the Alghieri family, where they came together and they said, you know something? Let's go back and try to rediscover our roots for winemaking and for farming and use the same traditions that were used from the nobility from the Venetian times. And they did. That's like Coke and Pepsi getting together and saying, let's make a better cola. So having two first-team all-Italian winemakers on one wine, if that's not enough for you, you turn this label around, and you know who the importer is? Michael Mondavi. So now you have a favorite son from America. Talk about a trifecta of amazing wine people all together in one wine. That's less than 20 bucks. In fact, I think we're selling it for less than 15. I mean, it says a lot. It says a lot. I mean, the wine itself has amazing flavors to it. But when you look at the whole rich history of it, it just adds so much more. And the story, it just makes this wine something that you want to enjoy on more than just the level of just sitting down at the table. It's more of an appreciation of the wine and appreciation for life. So, check this wine out and enjoy, everybody. Till next time.